Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Reducing the Royalty Resource Strain Through Automation. I'm Brian O'Leary, Executive Director of the Book Industry Study Group, and I'm pleased to be able to introduce today's content leader, David Marlin of Metacomet Systems. David is a longtime friend and supporter of BISG, as is Metacomet. David has in the past chaired a number of different working groups and committees for BISG, and he's been an active member of a lot of our conversations around rights and royalties. David, welcome today. I know you've prepared a presentation. We'd love to get you started, and we'll track the questions and come back to you at the end.
All right, great. Thank you, Brian. Can you hear me okay?
Just fine.
Great, thank you. All right, well, thank you. And thank you, everybody, for attending. So today we're going to be talking about reducing the royalty resource drain through automation. And I'd like to start by introducing you to Sarah. Now, I changed her name, but Sarah is a customer of ours. She had co-founded a publishing company several years ago and had achieved the success she had been dreaming of when she started the company. She had hundreds of titles, many successful titles on her backlist. She had a knack for picking and promoting books. But when she called us, she was overwhelmed, and she was actually in tears on the phone, explaining to us how royalties had taken over her life. She had grown herself into misery, as she had put it. She had staff, but she was the only one who really understood how royalties were paid. And she was spending nearly full time, nearly 40 hours a week, doing nothing but managing royalties. So sales for Sarah had been coming from multiple different sources. She was managing spreadsheets. She had spreadsheets everywhere, stored on folders all over her computer and her network. All kinds of errors were piling up. And probably worst of all, she had strained relationships with her authors. They were getting upset about late payments. She wasn't able to answer their questions. She wasn't able to even, in many cases, take calls. So I'm going to walk you through Sarah's journey, which is the journey we've seen hundreds of times with publishers over the years. I'm going to show you how you can get from the stressed out state of managing royalties to a relaxed state where it's not an issue in your life at all. And I'm going to do that by showing you the 4 phases of royalty management and how you go about automating them. I'm also going to talk about some of the blockers that publishers have when it comes to achieving automation and how to get past them. And finally, I'm going to talk a bit about some of the critical concepts to keep in mind as you make the journey to automation. As Brian said, as questions come up, please put them in the Q&A and we'll answer them at the end. And just as a quick unrelated to royalties, for any of you who might be worried about AI taking over your job, check out the 3-armed AI angry author on the top right. Just thought that was amusing. All the images I'm using in here, if any of you are curious, I use this service I subscribe to called Ideogram to generate most of these. So why was Sarah struggling? Most people see royalties as a bunch of overwhelming, often unconnected steps. But in fact, there's really, as we came to realize over the years, there's really 4 distinct phases of royalty management. As with every publisher that's in a situation similar to Sarah, the key to getting out of that situation is to take a step back and look holistically at these 4 phases. So everything starts at the top left with what we call the acquisition phase. This is where you sign an author to a title or multiple titles, and really the contract is the heart of that. and all the rules that define how royalties get paid out. Then you go through the process of bringing those books to market, and now you're receiving sales data for all of your titles. And most of our customers receive sales data. Most publishers receive sales data from multiple different sources. Sometimes is over 100 sources. We've seen several situations where publishers are getting 100 different sales files that they have to manage, often on a monthly basis. So your sales data comes in. Then you need to process that sales data through the rules that you captured or are stored in your contracts. And oftentimes in those, as those royalties are calculated, there's a lot of really valuable information that is kind of stuck in all that data, and you really need it available to you in the form of reports. And then finally, at the end of the royalty period, whether it's monthly, quarterly, semi-annual, or annual, you need to distribute royalty statements along with the corresponding payments for your authors. So Sarah was struggling with all four of these phases. She had contracts stored everywhere. She didn't have them recorded in a very standardized way to automate the process. You know, there was data in Excel spreadsheets, some data in some other systems that she had tried. Her sales data was coming in from about a dozen different sources, and she was just really struggling with the whole process. So now that we understand that there are these four phases of royalty management, let's dig in a bit to see how Sarah was able to get her royalties under control. So the first thing we did with Sarah was we showed her that she really needs to capture her contracts in the form of data, of structured data, so that they can be automated, so that the royalty process can be automated. So there's several things that can add complexity to contracts. Some publishers have very simple rules, just like a single flat rate rule. This is, I'm sorry, like a single percentage based rule. This is common in hybrid type publishing deals. And then some publishers have really complex rules. Some of the things that Sarah was dealing with was she had multiple royalty recipients on several of her titles. She had different rates for all different types of books, and those rates could vary substantially. She even had a couple situations where she had different rates based on the retailer she was selling them through. So she might pay a different rate for titles sold through one online source versus another. She had situations where she had split royalties. She sold physical books, so she had situations where she was dealing with reserves against returns. She would do print runs, sell a batch of books to a bookstore. She'd get the returns, and she needed to protect herself against those excess returns by holding back reserves. So once we showed Sarah how to capture all of these rules in the form of structured data, you could see a light bulb go off in her head, and she started to get it. She could store all the crazy details from all these contracts in one centralized location. And you could see the anxiety in Sarah start to melt away. Now, it was a challenge because she was spending so much time doing royalties. I mean, again, it was basically a full-time job. She had to do all this kind of on the side. So another big stressor for Sarah was her sales file. So she was dealing, as I mentioned earlier, with about a dozen sales files every month. And as I'm sure many of you are aware, these sales files come in all kinds of different formats. They're often in different currencies. Some of them have multiple currencies in the same sales file. And so every month Sarah had to get a hold of these sales files, aggregate all the data together so she could run them through her spreadsheets and her older systems. She had to convert the currencies. Sometimes she had to do certain deductions, like she would deduct some, in certain cases, credit card fees out of the revenues before she calculated royalties. And it was a nightmare for Sarah. It was very hard to track and very easy to mess up. So we showed Sarah how when you get your royalties automated, um, you know, the automation process, whatever system you're using to do it, should be able to memorize the layout of all these different sales files, convert all the currencies, and do other types of manipulation to the sales files that you might need done. Um, and every sales source has its own layouts, its own mapping, so to speak. So once that was set up, all Sarah had to do was upload her sales files, and they would automatically be aggregated. She didn't even have to open them. No more, grabbing, moving columns around, copying, pasting sales data from one spreadsheet to another. They would just all get aggregated. And for some of the sales files she was working with, for instance, from her distributor, she didn't even need to get the sales file. They just fed straight from the distributor right into her sales aggregation. And they just appeared there, ready to be processed. So this process that would take her hours, maybe a couple days every month, and was full of stress and errors, it now just took minutes. And in terms of those errors, she now had reports that as soon as she loaded her sales data in, she could immediately see if there were any issues. Before this, she wasn't sure if she was accounting for every sale. It's virtually impossible to do if you don't have an automated system set up. But now she could quickly identify maybe some missing contracts, maybe some, any sales line item that hadn't been properly accounted for. As I'm sure you all know, publishers are genuinely interested in doing the right thing for their authors, with very few exceptions. And she wanted to make sure she was paying her authors correctly. And sure enough, sales had been slipping through the cracks. But now, because she had this aggregation tool, this way of combining sales data and comparing it to the contracts, she could see if there was any issues with her sales data. Now, in Sarah's case, she really wanted to get up and running very quickly. So she was doing this. She was in this phase of her training and implementation after just a few days. And as she saw the sales aggregation process, again, another light bulb went off in her head. It's like, wow, this is amazing. I get it. I get it. Now all of my sales are aggregated. I have all of my contracts as data. And so now all of my royalties can be automatically calculated. I don't have to sit there with Excel and feed the sales in. I don't have to make sure they're getting into this system or that system. They're just all being calculated. And even better than that, within seconds of loading her sales files, she had access to all of these calculations. She could now immediately see with the push of a button how much she owed for every author, for every title. She could see her royalty accruals at the ISBN level, at a per author level. And this was an insight that Sarah had never had access to before. All of this information in the form of reports. So now I'm going to show you the last phase. There was of the royalty management life cycle, which is your statements and your payments. And this is the part that was still getting to Sarah, because usually this is the last part when you're implementing a new royalty system, often the last part that you train on and the last part you show. So in Sarah's world, you took, the statements, royalty statements, the reports that you shared with your authors to show them how much they earned and why they earned that amount. That would be created in Excel. You'd convert it into a PDF. And then you'd have to take each individual PDF, attach it to an email, make sure you got the author's email right and you weren't sending the wrong PDF to the wrong author. And it was just for hundreds. I think she had close to 1,000 titles at this point, some with multiple authors, many with multiple authors. So she was sending out, maybe a couple thousand royalty statements. She was doing monthly royalties, um, which, again, she really wanted to do right by her authors. She wanted to pay them on a monthly basis. Um, but she didn't realize when she got started exactly what that involved. She got into publishing. Some people get into publishing because they love to pay royalties and they love to do all these calculations, but very few. Sarah loved to publish books. So, um, it was just so stressful getting all those statements out the door. And then not only that, whenever publishers wanted to, they had a question, sorry, authors, whenever authors had a question about their statements, why are these calculations showing up like this? Are you sure this is right? She'd have to dig up their statement. Hopefully she put it in a folder where she could find it. She'd have to go through and try and figure out how she came up with those numbers. Um, Authors complained that they were getting, multiple royalty statements instead of all their statements for all their books on one statement, all their reporting on one statement. Agents that she was working with were frustrated because they couldn't see a summary of how their authors were working. And the whole process was taking her, several days, maybe even close to a week, just to get the statements out the door. And then many more days answering the questions after she got the statements out the door. So fortunately, we still had one more training session left with Sarah, and where we showed her how to send out her statements. And she saw that with just the push of a button, all her authors immediately got their royalty statements. And that was all it took. Days of work getting these statements out the door was reduced to literally just the click of a button. And with another click of a button, she was able to generate a report of all the payments that were due to all of the authors. A lot of the authors didn't have a payment; they had an unearned advance, or maybe they had excess returns, and so they didn't have a payment. But for those that did, she could just push a button, and all those payments would be generated. And whatever system she was using to pay, Sarah happened to be uploading, doing the payments directly from a bank. So she was able to take that file, which was configured just for her bank, upload it to her bank, and automate all those payouts. Some publishers use various accounting systems. NetSuite's a popular one, Microsoft Dynamic, even QuickBooks. And we have customers whose payment method is sending this report to their spouse, who manually writes out all the checks to stick them in the mail. So whatever your payment method is, in Sarah's case, she was able to just download the payment report and send it out to, to upload it to her bank. So that process of having to manually type in all those payments one at a time, making sure she was clicking on the right account to pay them, making sure she was typing in the right amount, not making mistakes, that was all gone. And not only that, she was able to give her authors self-service access so they could view their statements online. So in the past, sometimes an author might say, I lost my statement from 2 months ago. I'm trying to reconcile everything. And she'd have to dig up their statement. Now they could just go online onto a portal she had set up for them, and they could view all their statements themselves. And not only that, they could do all kinds of other things. So today, in today's world, there's a lot of royalty portals out there. I'm proud to say that Metacomet, we were the first ones to have a commercially available author portal. But now, virtually all the royalty systems out there, there's a portal of some sort where authors can view their royalty statements. Some of them, they can change their contact information. So if their address changes, their contact information changes, they can update that right online and manage all that themselves rather than take up the time of the publisher. Because as any of you publishers who do your own royalties know, those questions from authors and agents, they're so important to answer because they're customer service for your authors and your agents, but they're so time consuming to look up that information. So the more you can give your authors to do themselves, it just benefits everybody. It makes them happier. It makes you happier. And this last phase of the royalty management life cycle, excuse me, this personally, this is my favorite part of seeing a customer go live because every time, I mean, I personally am not involved in the implementations anymore, but I love hearing the stories from the people here at Metacomet that do the implementations. Every time, they're always just amazed. Just push a button, that's it, and everybody gets their statements. And yeah, everybody just gets their statements. The authors get their statements, the agents get their statements, everybody is happy. And in Sarah's case, though, something kind of unusual happened. Our project manager, he hadn't been on that initial sales call where Sarah literally called up in tears. And he noticed that she was in tears again. There were different tears. He wasn't sure what to do. He wasn't sure why she was crying, but he asked her, and she responded something along the lines of, "For the first time in a year, I'm going to have my life back." So Sarah had gone from, um, literally spending 40 hours a week uh, to now seeing that this was only just going to take her a few hours a month to manage her monthly royalty statements. And so that's, what automation delivers. We see 90% reduction. Some people we've worked with have told us 95%, 98% reduction in the time spent. And that this is, as the name of the webinar suggests, this is the real benefit of automating your royalties. There's lots of other benefits too, which I'll talk about in a bit. Here is so I'm amazed at what AI can do. This is not Sarah. Um, I don't have a picture of Sarah, but this is after describing Sarah and in a happy state. This is what ideogram.ai came up with. So here is Sarah after getting the process automated. So again, when you get this process automated, you're going to save a huge amount of time. Most publishers can save 90+% of time in royalties. Their stress levels go way down. I mean, this is now just another simple back office operation. It's not something you have to, stress about every quarter or every 6 months, depending on how often you're doing your royalties. The errors virtually disappear. It does wonders for your author relationships. And now, Sarah and other publishers that go through this have more resources to spend on growing their business and acquiring titles. Um, so, um, so I'm going to talk
I
next a
was
little.
gonna, I was gonna, as you switch gears, I was gonna ask if you might want to answer one question about the that came up while you were presenting.
Yeah, sure. Please, Brian, go ahead.
Thanks. So the question from David is, how long did this take to install? I mean, what's the lead time and the prep and then to delivery? And a secondary question is, to what accounting systems do you kind of link to with the Metacomet product?
Yeah, okay, great. Well, thank you for that question. So, um, the important thing, I'm going to talk a little bit about in a bit about some things to consider when implementing systems in general, and particularly royalty systems. Um, one thing to consider is the experience of the whoever is doing it and how standardized their process is. We're fortunate in that we've been doing this for 25 years. It's the only thing that we do, and we have a very standardized process. So I'm not sure how long. I've heard horror stories. I've heard stories of implementations taking a year, 2 years, I know of one situation where I think it's still going on with a major publisher taking several years to implement. Um, and uh, that said, we had just to give you a sense of how quickly it can be done. We tell most people it's about a 3-month process between the time you decide to move forward and you're up and running with automated royalties. That's our experience. It's usually about 3 months. We've done it. In Sarah's case, we actually did it. Again, I changed Sarah's name, but in Sarah's case, we actually did it in about 3 or 4 days because she was so desperate to get this done. We had another situation, a major publisher had I don't know what happened, but all their systems had crashed and they didn't have backups for their royalty software. And so they approached us and they needed to get their quarterly statements. I mean, they had 10,000 plus titles. They needed to get a batch of their quarterly statements out within 2 weeks or they would be late. And we were able to get a 10,000 title publisher up and running in 2 weeks. So that's rushed for sure. So I would say on average, you should plan about 3 months. If you've got tens of thousands of titles, maybe 5 or 6 months. And then in terms of the accounting systems, you know, so we can work with any accounting system because there's so let's dissect that question a little bit. What is it about accounting systems that you need to integrate with? So there's the payments. That's kind of the most obvious one. And then there's also a lot of publishers, like to have their royalty accruals loaded into whatever their accounting system is. So the payments piece, that's really straightforward. We can integrate with virtually any accounting system out there. For instance, we're an official NetSuite partner. We have a direct integration with NetSuite. We can integrate with Microsoft Dynamics and older Microsoft products. We have an integration with QuickBooks. And then on the accrual side, that's kind of similar. But even if you don't have a direct integration, a good system will be able to export the data into a CSV file that's readily uploadable into whatever system is necessary. And that's really just a quick 2-step process. You download it from the royalty system and you upload it to the accounting system. So thank you for those questions. And again, if anybody, please add any other questions you have into the Q&A, and we'll cover those at the end. So what holds publishers back? Why did Sarah wait so long to implement an automated royalty system? Why do other publishers wait? We see this situation a lot. We have some very forward-thinking publishers, a lot of very well-known, editors who went off to start their own publishing business or experienced publishing veterans. The first system they'll get is a royalty system because they know that that's going to be the most time-consuming part of their business. But a lot of publishers, very often publishers that have grown, they've been very successful and they just, like all business, business is always changing. As you grow, there's more things you have to do. You hit a point where the royalty piece just becomes really unbearable, unmanageable, and such high risk. The horror stories I can tell you about about some publishers that we've worked with. One question publishers always have is it worth the cost? And so I often use this ROI concept, a very business schooly kind of concept. Is it worth the cost? Is the return on investment, the ROI there? So the basic kind of business school ROI formula is, what are you going to get out of it? What's the profit? So what's the benefit versus what's the cost of investment? Now, when you're thinking benefit, there's obviously the time savings. That one's pretty easy to measure. A lot of our customers, they'll experience like a 90% reduction in the amount of time they have to spend doing royalties. But the one that's not very easily quantifiable is risk. What is the risk reduction? I mean, you can think of risk reduction as an improvement. Like risk has a cost, another very business schooly concept, but risk has a cost. You can't always quantify that cost, although there are techniques to try and quantify that cost, but risk has a cost. Let me give you an example. Another customer of ours, so one thing that we do is, as I'll cover in a little bit, is whenever you go live with a new system, it's always very highly recommendable that you do a series of what we call parallel runs. So this is where you take your contracts, you run sales data through them in the new system, and you compare it to what you had been doing. So we were working with a publisher that had been using they've been doing it all in Excel forever. Pretty good sized publisher. I think they had a couple thousand titles. So we did, usually we'll just go back one period, maybe two periods, and they were doing quarterly statements. So we went back one period and none of the statements matched. They were all off by pretty substantial margins. I mean, some of them not substantial, but there were a lot that were off by substantial margins. And they thought, oh, okay. What happened? So they asked us to do another parallel run for the prior period before that. It's really easy to do. Once the contracts are loaded in, you just got to load the sales data in, and within like a minute or two, you have all the statements to compare and reports. And from 2 quarters ago, the statements were all wrong. So then they asked us if we would go back 2 years. So we went back 2 years, and their statements were just such a mess. They came to the realization that they had never, or at least not in the last several years, paid out accurate royalties. Now, a lot of people think, oh, well, they're just, like you read about it in the press sometimes, and you're like, oh, they're trying to rip off their authors. But that was absolutely not the case, because they ripped themselves off equally as much as they did their authors. So it kind of came out in the wash. They didn't have any more money in their pocket because of this. Sometimes they overpaid their authors just as much as they underpaid them. And it's just, I mean, put yourself in their shoes. Think about the nightmare of that. So you either owe your authors money, and then you have to tell them that you've been shorting them for years. That doesn't look good. Or you have to tell them, well, you guys owe us money. We overpaid you. And no matter what you tell them, they are going to lose all faith in you. I don't remember how this publisher resolved that situation. I mean, they had no choice. They had to move forward and make a change. They were a successful publisher. But fortunately, going forward, they never had that issue again. So that's risk. That's one element of risk is, you're overpaying, you're underpaying, you're ruining your author relationships. And then risk can be taken to other levels too. It gets out in the press. I read a few weeks ago about a publisher that went bankrupt in the UK, and none of their authors are going to get paid. But that story, that publicity, it's not always with bankrupt publishers. Sometimes, if you guys who have been in the industry for years, you remember several big publishers getting kind of New York Times level news stories about not paying royalties correctly. So that's another element of risk. Another element of risk is one publisher, before we worked with them, this was 15 years ago, they were a public company. They had been audited, and their auditors reported what's called a material weakness. So any of you guys who have CPA backgrounds, that's like basically the worst thing that you can, the worst sort of score you can get from your auditors is a material weakness. It means you have no idea what's going on, and you have no ability to prove that you've done it right. So there's all kinds of risks, and those risks, you've got to incorporate into that net profit piece of the investment. So another thing we find when people look at this return on investment formula is they substantially undervalue their time. Like Sarah, if she thought, okay, my time's worth $100 an hour. I don't know what she had in her head. But no, Sarah, your time's probably worth $500 an hour, $1,000 an hour. The company doesn't exist without you. And you, the founder, the person responsible for that, for your business's success, you're spending 40 hours a week doing royalties. Your time is worth way more than what you think it is. So that's one consideration is the cost worries. Another consideration are the implementation concerns. There's so many horror stories about implementations, and I'll come back to this in a little bit and talk a little bit about some of those horror stories. But a lot of people are concerned with the implementation process, and so they don't move forward. And that's where having a standardized process is so beneficial. And again, we'll talk more about the implementation piece. The complexity of contracts. I mean, you saw a sample of contracts several slides back. Some publishers are concerned that our contracts are so complex, there's no way to automate the process. I don't think it's so unusual to see a contract that can't be automated. You know, there's a lot of complexity that's capable of being automated. And then probably, one of the biggest ones is fear of change. So that company I was telling you about that had to do that 2 week, with 10,000 titles, 2 week implementation. We have been talking to them for 2 years, and they just didn't want to change. They were just so afraid that if they changed, it was going to mess everything up. And then it was forced on them. So a lot of publishers don't move forward because they're just concerned with that fear of change. And it is a true fear, and it is something, it can be a challenge, but getting to the other side of that has such value that, it's worth it to get to the other side of the rainbow. So going back to the implementation piece. So how do you make sure that you actually are successful when you implement a new royalty system? So one of the first things I'm going to say is make sure you're going with someone with a company that's experienced in this realm. There's a few of us in the publishing space that are check multiple references. And now, I often am skeptical of references because, obviously, if you ask us for references, we're going to give you people who we know are going to give us good references. Everybody is, right? But there are companies out there that claim to be able to do royalties that don't have enough successful implementations to give out references. I know of stories. Oh my God, the stories I've heard. I have heard stories of publishers, pretty big publishers, spending hundreds, if not $1 million or more, implementing a new royalty system, and then after 2 years, pulling the plug. It was just not going to work. It was never going to work. So make sure that they have several references that you can check with and talk that are similar to you. The next thing I would say is get a fixed cost implementation quote. There's no reason. I hear all the time about publishers who, they pay, oh, it's going to be about $50,000 to implement. And then, oh, we need another 20 for this. Oh, we didn't anticipate that. Royalties, they're very complex. Some people say that royalties are the most complex part of a publishing operation outside maybe warehouse management, but in terms of the logic in the code, in the technology. But they're very straightforward at the same time. I mean, you have contracts, you have sales data, you process the sales data through the contracts. there's no reason you should not be able to get a very reasonable fixed cost implementation on a royalty system. If you're working with a vendor that's not going to offer you a fixed cost implementation, now, there are some situations where maybe you can say, okay, there's going to be some variability, but in 90% of the cases, um, it should be, you should know what it's going to cost, and if your vendor goes over that, they should eat that. Get a fixed cost implementation. It's a straightforward thing to get somebody up and running on royalties. Um, Make sure that, so it's kind of obvious, you have to do these parallel runs that I spoke about, but do them early and do them often. Don't wait until the whole, like, do a parallel run with a few contracts to make sure that, just like from a, like as a proof of concept, like, okay, if you can't get 5 contracts automated, then how are you going to get 1,000 contracts automated? So do early parallel runs. Sometimes it's no harder to do a parallel run for all your data than it is for 5. I mean, it should be so easy to do parallel runs. Like, you load the data in, it should just take a matter of minutes to process your sales. I mean, even if it's millions of lines, maybe it'll take a half an hour on a decent system. But get those parallel runs done as quickly and as soon as you can in the process to validate that everything's going to work out. And then another one we see a lot is internal buy-in. So especially for larger publishers, but really for everybody, if the person or people who are doing the royalties, who are responsible for the royalties, aren't um, aren't sold on what you're trying to accomplish, aren't sold on the benefit to them, they can so easily sabotage the process. And I've seen that. I've seen that happen. Um, uh, and it's a real challenge. We had one customer, they had the same person doing royalties for 30 years, and she just did not want to change. The CEO, the CTO, the head of finance, they wanted to change. They went ahead. We kind of made the mistake of going forward without this woman's buy-in on our side, but eventually through a lot of careful relationship building, we were able to convince her, and now they're up and running, and everything's really smooth and automated. But you've got to get that internal buy-in. And then the last piece I would say here is the author communication piece. Keep your authors posted. Let them know there's going to be changes coming. Let them know how it's going to affect them. Send them out a sample of a royalty statement so if it's going to change, they understand how it's going to change. Similarly with the agents, let your agents know, because otherwise, if you let them know, they will hopefully be excited about it. But if you don't let them know, you can have the total opposite effect, and they're really upset about it. And they don't like the change. Where all you had to do to get them to like the change was just let them know a month or two in advance that this change was coming. Um, so the so so now Sarah was she had achieved the point where she had gotten tremendous freedom, and her authors went from being extremely upset, especially that 3-armed author on the top right. She was really pissed off, to being very happy. And not only that, but being able to promote her author relationships is a real selling point in attracting talent, attracting agents to work with them. And a lot, by automating the process, publishers like you have seen this change, this metamorphosis. Um, these are just some quotes from publishers who have made a change to an automated solution. So I would just, I'm pretty much done. I would just say to kind of summarize, get rid of the manual effort, get rid of the archaic systems or the systems that aren't working for you, get your time back, strengthen your author relationships, reduce and eliminate the risk and the errors, and focus on growth, not not the grunt work of dealing with all those spreadsheets. So with that, I encourage you to please put any additional questions you have in. I am always available. I'll just leave this up as some of the questions start to come in. Please feel free to reach out to me or anyone here at Metacom at any time if you'd like to talk about royalties. But now I'd love to take some questions.
Thank you, David. I really appreciate the overview and the case studies that you were able to bring to the conversation today. It was an observation from David when you were talking about references that to enhance those references with questions about the number of seats in an implementation, if there's a reference, and also the number of cycles, royalty or payment cycles that a reference client has been through, so you get a sense of both how big and how long they've been doing it.
Absolutely. It's so important to that question about the cycles is very important because we've discovered over the years that it actually takes 3 royalty cycles to uncover all of the problems that you might have. I mean, sometimes even more than that. But, if you're dealing with things like advances and reserves, it takes 3 royalty cycles to uncover all those problems. So definitely, that's a very good point. Make sure that any reference you speak to has been through more than 3 royalty cycles.
So we have a number of questions. Maybe I can just go through them quickly or as many, and get as many of these in front of you. One question is how much training do you think is needed to get people started on using a formal royalties accounting system?
So I can only speak to our experience, and it's very easy. It's exactly 4 hours of training. We have 4 training sessions. They're each an hour long, um, and and that's what it takes. Maybe another question this person may be trying to get at is how much effort is it going to take? So it's more than just the training, but it's getting the data and reviewing, those parallel runs to make sure everything's coming out the same. And what we find is, it can be as little as 6 or 7 hours, it can be 20 to 30 hours. It really just depends, but usually it's not too much more than that. Now, if you're dealing with a publisher with, thousands and thousands of statements, it could go more to the 60, 80 hours of total effort. But usually it's really just about, for like 1,000 title publisher, you're probably looking at about, maybe 12 hours of total effort from that publisher to get up and running.
Sure. And I imagine that if you talk about those 4 1-hour sessions, that's kind of just in time training. So you implement an aspect of a module or you go through some work to set up, a certain number of titles, a critical mass perhaps, and then you
Absolutely. It's those 4 phases of the royalty management life cycle I showed. We have one training for each of those 4 phases. And they're each about an hour long. And we do what we call productive training. So when we're teaching you how to enter a contract, we actually take your contracts and like a new contract you have, and we sit there with you as you enter it in. So you're actually getting work done during the training process.
Beth is asking a question. Talk about some of the things that can go wrong. I mean, you shared some of those in your case studies, but things to watch out for when you're trying to get up and running with a new system.
Yeah, so again, I think a lot of this goes to trying to get to the parallel runs as quickly as you can. We just had this one situation where uh, a company was so this is more of a revenue sharing situation, like a quote unquote kind of like hybrid environment versus a traditional publishing environment where they needed to load in all their expenses. Big company. And what they found was the people who were entering those expenses didn't they hadn't classified them properly. So they didn't know what type of expenses they were. They didn't know what title they belonged to. So get that stuff addressed as quickly as you can. Get to a parallel run as quickly as you can. Um, I think another thing to watch out for is making sure you have everybody's buy-in. Like I said before, like if you have one person who's, you have maybe a team of three people that are doing royalties and someone wants to sabotage the process, um, that's something that you got to keep an eye out for. And I would say, um, make sure you're dealing with experienced project managers. You don't want to be, if you're working with a company to implement a royalty system, you don't want to be working with someone that's implemented one or two systems. Ideally ask for someone who's been doing it for a long time.
So the project manager in this case is the project manager at the system side of
Yes, yes,
the
yes.
uh, uh, another question is how is data transferred and how would a publisher know if the data had been ingested properly? Is that a function of the kind of the true outs that you discussed, even with a small set of titles?
Yeah, so that's a great point. So the key thing is the sales data, because when you load the sales data in, if there's other data missing, that report that I showed you, you probably barely remember it because I went through it pretty quick, but that will show you any missing titles, any missing contracts, any missing authors. It'll just be the sales data. It's like we don't know how to deal with this royalty. So having access to a report like that and every month loading your sales data in and reviewing that report, we call it a sales reconciliation report. That's critical to catching errors. So the sales data is the most important piece. Now, how do we have some direct integrations for sales data. Most of those cases, people are loading data in from a dozen sources into our sales aggregator. The one technique that's widely considered, widely used for companies that are really trying to establish tight controls there is to use what we call control totals. So every file of sales data that you ingest, look at the total dollars, the total units, and the total lines in that file. If you ingest that sales into the royalty system, that royalty system should be able to just very clearly show you those control totals. And if they match, you pretty much know, you've done the best due diligence you can do from I think I'm not a CPA or a lawyer, but from my understanding, that's about as viable a control check as you can do is validate that the totals from that file match the totals that actually get into the system. Those three control totals. Um, in terms of how the data gets in, there's all kinds of different ways. We have some direct API integrations. For instance, if you're using Firebrand, all that Firebrand data just automatically shows up in Royalty Tracker. That can be set up. We have some direct integrations. We're a certified NetSuite provider, so we can send data directly to NetSuite. Um, a lot of times the data is just CSV files, and sometimes you talk with technology people and they're like, oh, CSV files, we need to do APIs. Well, I got to tell you something. CSV files are a 40, 50-year-old technology. They work great. They're really quick. You download the CSV file from one system, upload it into the other system. Two really quick steps, easy to verify, easy to validate. APIs, honestly, they work great, but they're happening in the background, and so you don't always have the same awareness. If we do a ton of APIs, and APIs are great, and they're definitely the gold standard, but don't dismiss using sharing of CSV files for sharing data. It's very effective, and you can even automate that. Like for instance, we take FTP feeds. Some of our customers send us 1,000 titles through an FTP feed. So their system is automatically sending that. We absorb it, and so that's another way that data can be shared.
I imagine too, and when you're trying to validate the system, the more opt-out phases like a CSV export, the easier it is to check both on the export and on the import side.
Yeah, and you have a you know, an artifact that you can use to audit in the future too. So there's other benefits to the CSV approach.
Fair to describe that as at the very least walk before you can run.
Yeah, yeah. In fact, even when we do set up APIs, you know, um, uh, we'll often just get started with the CSV file because even if the API just works out of the box, you still have authentication issues you got to work through, and they take a little bit of, not much, but a little bit of setting up. Whereas a CSV file, you can just load it right in.
Um, I have several other questions, but I only have 3 more minutes with you, so maybe two quick ones. One is, what's the critical mass from your view? I mean, how many titles might a publisher have before they should be looking at royalty automation seriously?
Yeah, so I've been getting asked that question for 20 something years, Brian, and the answer has stayed pretty much the same. Usually we find that when a publisher hits about 20 to 25 titles, they start making mistakes, quite a bit of mistakes. Sometimes it's even less than that. Um, and so, you know, if getting it right is really important, then that's probably about where you want to start looking at automating. In terms of the time efficiency, you know, it depends how good you are at doing it, how kind of how adept you are at working with Excel. If you're really good at working with Excel, maybe 20 to 25 titles is only taking you a few hours a month, but some people it might be taking them 40 hours a month. So I would say you're going to start making mistakes, and every publisher that does this in Excel is making mistakes. I've almost never not seen mistakes. Um, you know, that 20 to 25 threshold. Um, and if you're more concerned with time, maybe the threshold is a little closer to 50 to 100 titles.
But if you're a publisher publishing 4 new books a year, that means in your first 5 years, you need to start thinking about royalty management.
Yeah, I mean, we have some publishers that do only publish that number of books, but they're all very successful books, and their author relationships are their number one concern, and so they don't want to take any chance of making a mistake. So they just right from the start, even if they only have 10 books, they're using an automated system.
Well, we're almost at time, so one last question, which is you told the story of Sarah, not her real name. How typical is Sarah in her situation? I mean, you think that's the middle, the edge case? I mean,
I
what?
mean, I would say Sarah's the only one I'm aware of that came to us in tears. Um, uh, Actually, there is one other one. I can't remember who it was. I do remember it did happen a second time. Um, but you know, that level of stress is not uncommon, and it's not always felt that high. You know, it's often much lower in the publishing company that it's felt, where you know one poor person is stuck doing this, you know, 20 hours a week. It's quite common. I would say it's that the level of stress is quite common for there to be very high stress levels by the people doing the royalties.
Right. Well, that's important to know, and I think it gives us a good point at which to wrap up. Thank you, David, very much for giving us an overview of how to think about royalty automation and how to think about working with a partner who can help you in that area. It's always good to
Yeah.
see you, and I look forward to the chance to talk with you again soon.
Yeah, thank you very much, Brian. Thank you everybody who joined us. I greatly appreciate it. And please, you know, feel free to reach out anytime if I can be of assistance.
Thanks. Take care.
Okay, you too. Bye-bye.